Because this is a most unusual question, most unusual circumstance, and I'm being very cautious here, but I believe that the Prime Minister is responsible for the judgment of his ministers. There's no question about that. And therefore, while the example given does relate to matters to some extent within the ACT party, it was a question principally about the judgment of a minister. And in that regard, I would invite the Prime Minister to answer it, but mindful of the fact that he is not responsible for matters within the ACT party itself. The Honourable Gerry Brownlee first.
Mr Speaker, not wanting to dispute the position you've come to, but asking you to consider it a little further, because we do have Standing Order 1466, which says the Prime Minister is answerable for any statements made as Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister is not answerable for actions in a non-ministerial capacity, whether as Leader of the Opposition or Leader of a political party. Now, Mr Speaker, if you are now asking the Prime Minister, if that ruling stands, then the Prime Minister would not be responsible for anything or any question of judgment on his part as Leader of the National Party or for the time that he is the Leader of the Opposition. But now we seem to be saying that the Prime Minister does become responsible for answering questions about matters that were undertaken, decided or whatever by another political party leader prior to the formation of government. Now, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister, it would seem to me, through 1464 and even 1471 that you quoted, is responsible for matters that relate to ministerial judgment, but surely not judgment that political parties make. Otherwise, sir, we're a very short step from the Prime Minister being responsible for the political policies of parties who are party to government or in some sort of governance arrangement with the party that is leading government. And that too would be very unfortunate. I think this is not a fine line. I think it's quite patently clear that the matters that relate to Mr Hyde's relationship with Mr Garrett prior to the formation of government are in the past and have nothing to do with the way in which he's exercised his responsibilities as a minister, for which the Prime Minister is directly responsible. Matters that were in the past and that are now require the Prime Minister to reflect back, I think are quite unreasonable.
The Honourable Peter Dunn was...
Mr Speaker, Mr Brownlee has substantially covered the point that I was going to raise, but I really wanted to raise a question that arises out of your original ruling, sir, and that is, if the Prime Minister is to have a responsibility, is it not for the conduct and judgment of ministers as it relates to their particular portfolios and the overall performance of government, rather than just in a blanket sense? Because there may be issues that fall outside the impact on a minister's portfolio or the overall activities of government, and therefore how can the line be that the Prime Minister also has a responsibility in those areas as well? I think this is an extension of the point that Mr Brownlee was raising, but I think it does go to the heart of what is the point at issue here, sir.
I'll hear the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
See, if I could just address the matter that Mr Brownlee raised. Mr Brownlee, it seems to me, was saying, if I'm correct, that because the alleged lack of judgment occurred initially prior to becoming a minister, then somehow it was not the Prime Minister's responsibility to answer in that respect. But I would put it to you, sir, that the judgment question may have occurred sometime before the member held the warrant, but continued, sir, and the question goes to it, right up to when the warrant was picked up by Mr Hyde and continued up until, shall we say, a few days ago, sir. So it does form a ministerial responsibility. The alleged cover-up continued right through when he was a minister.
Speaking to the point of order.
Well, I'll hear the Honourable David Park, but that'll be the last one.
Yes, I just want to
a bit of time.
Develop that, sir, because I think Mr Cosgrove is right. Because if we take if we take an example where something might be withheld from a Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister, but for that withholding, might not have made someone a minister because he might not trust them. And that must be a matter that goes to the responsibility of the Prime Minister if in the future he decides to get rid of a minister, as the Prime Minister chose to do in respect of Richard Worth. So I think that there's no doubt that the Prime Minister has responsibility for the conduct of his ministers. He can say, I think that conduct is perfectly acceptable to me, but he can be asked whether it is.
I'll hear the Honourable Gerry Brownlee briefing.
Mr. Speaker, the point that's being suggested by both Mr. Cosgrove and by the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove and the Honourable David Parker suggests that the Prime Minister, as Prime Minister, holds ultimate responsibility for everything his ministers do and have done. Mr. Speaker, standing orders over a period of time, Speaker's rulings over a period of time, clearly the incident around Winston Peters in 2008, but more poignantly I think the incident of the breakdown of the alliance in 2002 clearly established that the Prime Minister does not have any responsibility for actions undertaken by leaders of political parties. We know, sir, that, for example, the Prime Minister cannot be questioned about the National Party dealings in the House because he is the leader of the National Party and that is of no relevance or business to this House. Mr. Speaker, for this question to stand, there would need to be the citing of a particular failure of ministerial judgment as opposed to a perception or an allegation of a failure of judgment in relation to activities as a party leader. The issues around judgment as a party leader are going to be in fact judged by voters and by the general public. But, sir, the Prime Minister is not required to have a particular view on that. His responsibility is to ensure that he has a functioning ministry that can lead government or can form a government. And, Mr. Speaker, that is where it should stop. If we open this up, then, Mr. Speaker, I think it's, as I said before, a very short step for the Prime Minister having to answer for policy decisions and policy positions taken by other parties prior to their coming into Parliament, into government arrangements.
I thank honourable members for their further points on this matter, and I repeat what I said, this is actually a very tricky issue in relation to our standing orders, and an important issue, and that's why I've allowed time on it. If I come back to the point raised by the Honourable Peter Dunn, I've got to disagree with the Honourable Peter Dunn insofar as the Prime Minister is responsible for the conduct of his ministers, not just in their pursuit of their ministerial responsibilities, but the Prime Minister has a wider role of responsibility with respect to the conduct of his ministers and the judgment of his ministers. I think there is no question about that the Prime Minister has a wider responsibility there. As distinct from individual ministers, the Prime Minister has a wider responsibility. The Prime Minister, of course, has no responsibility for what another party or its leader might do. And this is where this issue gets quite complex, in that we have the leader of a party who is also a minister. The Prime Minister has responsibility for the judgment of that minister in his capacity as a minister. Now, what makes this, and therefore the question would normally have been a perfectly proper question. But the example given in the question related to an action of the minister that it could be argued was in some way related to his role as party leader of the ACT Party. And I accept argument down that track. But I think where I face a dilemma is if I rule the question out totally, I'm tending to shift the line somewhat in terms of the Prime Minister's responsibilities with respect to the conduct and judgment of ministers. And I don't want to do that because the Prime Minister must be accountable for his ministers. He's not accountable for statements by any National Party person. He's not accountable in this House for his role as leader of the National Party. Not at all. There's no way it's getting confused with that at all. If one looks at, someone mentioned Standing Order, Speaker's Ruling 1466, totally different issue there. 1466, that's not relevant to this particular issue. This issue is the very difficult point of the example given in the question, asking the Prime Minister about whether he had confidence or whatever it was. He was being questioned about the Minister's judgment. The example given was right on the margins. And if the question had been whether directly to do with that issue, I'd ruled it out. But the question wasn't directly to do with that issue at all. The question was about the Prime Minister's judgment, the Prime Minister's acceptance of the judgment of a minister acting in a certain way. And I think a lot of time has gone by now. I believe I believe I cannot rule the question out. However, I stress to the Prime Minister